The millionaire cruelly humiliated the nurse who was taking care of him the very next day. The sun was just beginning to peek through the towering skyline of Dallas as Olivia stepped out of her modest car, clutching the handles of her worn leather bag. Today marked her second day as the private nurse to William Graham, a reclusive and notoriously sharp-tongued millionaire. Standing in front of the sprawling gates of his estate, she inhaled deeply, steeling herself for what she hoped would be a better day. Little did she know, it would turn out worse than she could have ever imagined. Inside the grand mansion, the air was cold and unwelcoming, much like its owner. William sat in his wheelchair by the window, his sharp gray eyes fixed on the Dallas skyline. His once imposing figure had diminished due to the illness that now confined him, but his presence remained commanding. Despite his fortune and the world of luxury around him, William was a man with little warmth left to give. "About time you showed up," William snapped the moment Olivia walked in, his voice dripping with irritation. "If you're going to keep me waiting, I might as well hire someone who can read a clock." Olivia bit her lip, her grip tightening around the bag on her shoulder. She had dealt with difficult patients before, but something about William's tone cut deeper. Despite her professional demeanor, she couldn't help but feel the sting of his words. "I'm here on time, Mr. Graham," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "Is there anything specific you need this morning?" William scoffed, wheeling himself toward the breakfast table that had been meticulously set by his household staff. "I need you to not hover over me like some overpaid babysitter. I can handle my own damn breakfast." But as he reached for the coffee pot, his hand trembled, spilling the hot liquid across the pristine tablecloth. Olivia instinctively stepped forward, grabbing a cloth to clean up the mess. "I've got it," she said gently, her tone filled with patience. "Don't patronize me," William barked, slamming his hand on the table. "Do you think I'm completely helpless? Is that why you're here? To remind me of how pathetic I've become?" Olivia froze for a moment, taken aback by the intensity of his outburst. She had heard about William's reputation. A man who built his empire through sheer ruthlessness, a man feared and respected in equal measure. But seeing him now, so consumed by anger and bitterness, she realized there was more to his hostility than arrogance. "I'm here to help you, Mr. Graham," she said quietly, her gaze meeting his. "That's my job. Nothing more, nothing less." William's face hardened, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though he might say something else. But instead, he turned his wheelchair abruptly and rolled away, leaving Olivia standing in the dining room with the cloth still in her hand. The rest of the day unfolded in a similar pattern. Every attempt Olivia made to assist William was met with sharp remarks and biting sarcasm. He criticized the way she adjusted his pillows, accused her of being too slow when helping him with his physical therapy, and even mocked her choice of clothing. "Do they not pay you enough to afford something decent?" he sneered at one point, eyeing her simple scrubs. Olivia felt the sting of humiliation but refused to let it show. She had learned long ago that dignity was something no one could take from her, no matter how cruel their words. As the evening approached, Olivia sat in her small quarters within the mansion, reflecting on the day. She couldn't understand why someone with so much wealth and privilege could be so cold and bitter. Was it the illness? Or was William Graham simply a man who had always lived in the shadows of his own pain? But as she glanced at the small photograph tucked into the pocket of her bag, a photo she carried everywhere she went, her heart tightened. There was something she hadn't told anyone. A reason she had taken this job despite its challenges. A secret that connected her to William Graham in ways he could never suspect. In the mansion's grand library, William sat alone, a glass of whiskey in hand. His thoughts wandered to places he didn't want to go, memories he had spent years trying to bury. He didn't know it yet, but the woman he had spent the day tearing down was the very person who would unearth those memories, and with them, truths that would change both their lives forever. The tension in the Graham mansion wasn't new. It was a reflection of its owner. William Graham had spent most of his 56 years carving out a legacy in the oil and gas industry. Born into modest beginnings in Fort Worth, he was the son of a steelworker and a housemaid. His rise to the top had been marked by relentless ambition and sacrifice. By his mid-30s, William was one of the wealthiest men in Dallas, a self-made billionaire who turned every challenge into an opportunity. But that success had come at a cost. William's relentless drive left little room for kindness. His relationships were transactional, his trust hard-earned but easily broken. Friends had turned into enemies, partners into competitors. Even his family wasn't spared. His estranged daughter, Emily, hadn't spoken to him in years, blaming his ambition for the collapse of their once loving bond. The mansion he lived in, grand and imposing, felt more like a fortress than a home, a fitting reflection of the man himself. The illness that now confined him to a wheelchair was, in his eyes, life's cruelest betrayal. A sudden and severe stroke had robbed him of the control he cherished. His speech had recovered, but his body refused to obey. His independence was gone, and with it, any remnants of the power he wielded so fiercely. To William, the world owed him, and he made sure everyone around him felt the weight of his resentment. On the other hand, Olivia was everything William was not. At 32, she had lived a life defined by resilience and compassion. Born and raised in a working-class neighborhood in Dallas, Olivia was the eldest of 3 siblings. After her mother's sudden death when Olivia was just 16, she had taken on the role of caregiver for her younger brother and sister. While her peers were worrying about prom dresses and college applications, Olivia was working double shifts at a local diner to make ends meet. Her dream of becoming a nurse had been a beacon of hope in those challenging years. With sheer determination, she put herself through nursing school, juggling classes and work. By the time she earned her license, Olivia had become known for her steady hands and even steadier heart. She believed in the dignity of every human being, a conviction that guided her work. But life hadn't spared her its share of heartbreak. 2 years earlier, Olivia had suffered a devastating loss. Her fiancé, Marcus, had died in a car accident just months before their wedding. The grief had left a deep scar, one she hid beneath her calm exterior. She found solace in her work, dedicating herself to patients in need. To Olivia, every act of care was a way to honor Marcus's memory. When the offer to work for William Graham came, Olivia hesitated. His reputation preceded him. A tyrant in a 3-piece suit, now a broken man trapped in his own bitterness. But the pay was too good to refuse. Her younger brother was starting college, and her sister, a single mother, needed help with her child. Taking the job wasn't just a choice. It was a necessity. What Olivia didn't expect was how quickly William's hostility would challenge her resolve. His words were daggers, designed to wound. Yet, as she observed him during their brief interactions, she couldn't help but notice flashes of vulnerability. His hands shook not just from physical weakness, but from a deeper, unspoken fear. His sharp tongue masked a profound loneliness. There was one moment in particular that stayed with her. On her first day, she had walked into his study to find him staring at a photograph on his desk. It was a picture of a young girl, no older than 10, with long brown hair and a radiant smile. When Olivia asked who it was, William had snapped at her, telling her to mind her own business. But in that fleeting instant, she had seen something in his eyes, pain, regret, perhaps even love. For William, Olivia was an unwelcome reminder of everything he despised: vulnerability, dependence, and the care he didn't believe he deserved. For Olivia, William was a puzzle, a man whose anger seemed rooted in wounds far deeper than his illness. Neither of them could have predicted how their lives were intertwined, or how the truth would shatter everything they thought they knew about themselves. The days that followed were an exercise in endurance for Olivia. Every morning, she arrived at William's mansion determined to carry out her duties with professionalism and grace, but his relentless hostility made each moment feel like a test of her resolve. For William, having Olivia around was a constant reminder of the power he had lost. Her kindness, her patience. It all grated on him in ways he couldn't fully explain. "Do you always smile like that, or is it part of your training?" William asked one afternoon, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Olivia was helping him with his physical therapy, gently guiding his hand as he struggled to lift a small weight. "It's not a smile, Mr. Graham," Olivia replied, keeping her tone even. "It's called encouragement. You should try it sometime." Her calm retort caught him off guard. Most people shrank under William's sharp tongue, but Olivia rarely flinched. If anything, her quiet resilience seemed to irritate him more. "Encouragement," he repeated bitterly. "Let me tell you something about encouragement, nurse. It's a crutch for the weak. In my world, you either succeed or you don't. No one holds your hand." Olivia paused for a moment, meeting his icy gaze. "Maybe that's the problem, Mr. Graham. You've spent your whole life walking alone." The words hung in the air like a challenge, but William said nothing. He turned his head away, signaling that their session was over. Despite their clashes, Olivia refused to give up. She saw glimpses of the man William once was, hidden beneath layers of anger and regret. One evening, as she was tidying up his study, she noticed an old record player in the corner. It was dusty, its needle long and used. Next to it sat a stack of vinyl records, one with the title Moonlight Serenade scrawled in elegant script. "You don't strike me as a sentimental type," Olivia said, holding up the record. William glanced at her from his wheelchair, his expression hardening. "Put that down." Olivia hesitated, but set the record back in its place. "Music can help with stress, you know," she said softly. "It might even make you a little less prickly." "I don't need a lecture on my temperament," William snapped. "And I certainly don't need unsolicited advice from a nurse who barely knows me." The venom in his tone stung, but Olivia didn't let it show. Instead, she finished her task and left the room, leaving William alone with his thoughts. Later that night, William found himself staring at the record player. Memories he had buried long ago began to resurface. Dancing in the living room with his wife, her laughter echoing in the air. Those days felt like a lifetime ago, lost in the wake of his relentless ambition. He closed his eyes, trying to suppress the ache in his chest, but it lingered, a ghost of the man he used to be. Meanwhile, Olivia sat in her small quarters, replaying the day's events in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that William's anger was a shield, protecting something far more fragile. Why else would a man so powerful lash out at someone who only wanted to help? The conflict between them deepened when Olivia made an unintentional mistake during one of his therapy sessions. While adjusting his wheelchair, she accidentally bumped it against a table, causing a glass of water to spill onto his lap. "For God's sake, are you completely incompetent?" William shouted, his voice echoing through the room. "Is this what they teach you in nursing school? How to make a bad situation worse?" "I'm sorry, Mr. Graham," Olivia said quickly, grabbing a towel. "Sorry doesn't fix anything," he snapped, his face red with anger. "If you can't even handle this, maybe you're in the wrong profession." The outburst cut deeper than Olivia expected. She had dealt with difficult patients before, but William's words felt personal, as if he were deliberately trying to wound her. That night, as she sat alone, Olivia found herself questioning why she had taken the job. The pay was good, yes, but was it worth the emotional toll? And yet, something kept her from walking away. Maybe it was the fleeting moments of vulnerability she saw in William, or maybe it was the secret she carried, a secret that tied her fate to us in ways he couldn't yet imagine. For William, The conflict wasn't just with Olivia. It was with himself. Every time he looked at her, he saw a reflection of his own failures, of the family he had pushed away, the love he had lost, and the life he had built on a foundation of loneliness. He hated her for being a reminder of everything he had tried to forget. But deep down, he also feared her, because Olivia, with her quiet strength and unwavering kindness, was breaking through the walls he had spent a lifetime building. The storm came unexpectedly. Dallas was no stranger to sudden bursts of rain, but this storm was relentless, drenching the city and shrouding the Graham mansion in a veil of gray. The heavy downpour seemed to mirror the tension brewing inside, where the fragile dynamic between William and Olivia was about to shift in ways neither of them could foresee. It started like any other day. Olivia arrived early, her footsteps echoing softly through the grand halls. William was in the sitting room, staring out at the rain to the floor-to-ceiling windows. His wheelchair was positioned at an angle, his hand resting on the armrest, trembling slightly. Olivia noticed the subtle shake, but said nothing. She had learned by now that pointing out William's vulnerabilities only fueled his anger. "Good morning, Mr. Graham," she said gently, placing his breakfast tray on the table. "Morning," he scoffed without looking at her. "What's so good about it?" Olivia let the comment slide and moved to prepare his medication. As she worked, she couldn't help but glance at him. There was something different in his demeanor today, an unusual stillness, as if the storm outside had seeped into him. "Do you want to talk about anything?" she ventured cautiously. William finally turned to her, his gray eyes narrowing. "What makes you think I want to talk to you? You're here to do your job, not to play therapist." Olivia met his gaze without flinching. "Sometimes talking helps, even for people like you." "People like me?" he repeated, his voice low and cutting. "And what exactly do you mean by that?" "People who carry more pain than they're willing to admit," Olivia replied simply. William stared at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed as though he might respond, but instead he wheeled himself away, disappearing down the hall. Later that afternoon, the storm intensified and the power in the mansion flickered before cutting out entirely. Olivia found William in his study, sitting in the dim light of a single candle. The room felt heavy with unspoken tension. "You okay in here?" Olivia asked, stepping inside. "I'm fine," William replied curtly, but his tone lacked its usual bite. As she moved closer, Olivia noticed an open file on his desk. It contained photographs and documents, financial reports, legal papers, and a handwritten letter. She didn't mean to look, but one name caught her eye: Emily Graham. Before she could say anything, William slammed the file shut. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded. "I wasn't," she began, but he cut her off. "Don't lie to me. You saw it, didn't you? Emily's name." Olivia hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "I didn't mean to invade your privacy." William's hands clenched the armrest of his wheelchair, his knuckles white. "Privacy," he muttered bitterly. "That's a luxury I don't have anymore. Not when everyone feels entitled to know my life, my failures." The anger in his voice cracked, revealing a hint of something deeper: grief. "Emily is your daughter, isn't she?" Olivia asked softly. William's jaw tightened, and for a moment, she thought he might lash out. But instead, he let out a heavy sigh, his shoulders sagging under the weight of an invisible burden. "She was," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I haven't seen her in years. Not since she walked out of this house and out of my life." The admission hung in the air, raw and unguarded. For the first time, Olivia saw William not as the bitter, hardened man he had become, but as a father mourning the loss of his child. "What happened?" Olivia asked gently. William shook his head, his gaze fixed on the rain streaking the window. I pushed her away, like I pushed everyone else away. I thought I was protecting her, giving her a life free from my mistakes. But all I did was make her hate me. The vulnerability in his voice was almost unbearable to hear. Olivia wanted to say something, anything, to ease his pain, but she knew there were no simple answers. In the silence that followed, the storm outside began to subside, the rain tapering into a soft drizzle. William reached for the file on his desk and held it out to Olivia. "Take it," he said gruffly. "You're so damn curious. You might as well know the full story." Olivia hesitated but took the file, her hands trembling slightly. As she opened it, she realized the documents told a story far more complicated than she had imagined. A story of love, loss, and decisions that had left scars on both William and Emily. For the first time since she had started working for him, Olivia felt like she was beginning to understand the man behind the mask. And for William, handing over that file was an act of trust he hadn't extended to anyone in years. The turning point had come, not with an explosion of anger, but with the quiet unraveling of a man who had spent too long hiding from his own truth. The days following William's revelation about Emily were unlike anything Olivia had experienced during her time at the Graham mansion. The file he had given her contained pieces of his life that painted a far more complex picture than the one she had imagined. She had spent her evenings reading through the documents, piecing together the fractured story of a man who had built an empire but lost his way in the process. Emily was William's only child, born during the early years of his meteoric rise to success. The documents detailed how he had poured himself into his work, often at the expense of his family. His wife, Julia, had tried to hold their home together, but the strain of William's ambition eventually drove her to leave. Emily, just a teenager at the time, had stayed with her father, believing that she could be the bridge between her parents. But William had failed her. As his wealth grew, so did his expectations for Emily. He saw her as the heir to his empire, pushing her relentlessly to excel. When Emily expressed a desire to pursue a career in art, a passion far removed from the corporate world, William dismissed it as a waste of time and talent. Their fights became more frequent, more heated, until one day, Emily walked out of the mansion, vowing never to return. Olivia couldn't stop thinking about the pain woven into those pages. It explained so much about William's behavior, the anger, the bitterness, the walls he had built around himself. She realized that his cruelty wasn't born of malice, but of regret and self-loathing. And yet, understanding his pain didn't make his words any less cutting or his actions any easier to bear. One evening, as Olivia was preparing William's dinner, she decided to take a chance. She placed a tray on the dining table and sat across from him, something she had never done before. "What do you think you're doing?" William asked, his tone sharp but lacking the venom it once held. "I'm sitting," Olivia said simply. "We need to talk." "About what?" he asked, narrowing his eyes. "About Emily," Olivia replied. William's expression darkened, and for a moment, she thought he might wheel himself away. But instead, he stayed, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. "You think reading a few papers makes you an expert on my life?" he said, his voice low and tense. "No," Olivia said, meeting his gaze. "But it makes me someone who understands what you've been carrying all these years. And I think you want to talk about it, even if you don't know how." William let out a bitter laugh. "What would be the point? She's gone. She made her choice. Did she?" Olivia asked. "Or did you push her away because you were too afraid to admit you were wrong?" Her words hung in the air, sharp and unforgiving. William's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. "I think you've been punishing yourself ever since she left," Olivia continued. "And now you're punishing me because I remind you of her. But you still have a chance to make things right. She's out there, William. You can reach out to her." William looked at her, his eyes clouded with emotion. For a long moment he said nothing, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. "I wouldn't even know where to start," he admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "You start by apologizing," Olivia said, "by telling her the truth, that you miss her, that you love her." The words seemed to hit William like a blow. He turned his head away, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his grief. "You make it sound so simple," he said bitterly. "It's not simple," Olivia said. "It's hard, but it's worth it, and it's not too late." William didn't respond, but Olivia could see the wheels turning in his mind. For the first time, he seemed to be considering the possibility that there might still be a way forward. That night, as Olivia left the mansion, she felt a flicker of hope. William's walls were beginning to crack, and she knew that if he could find the courage to face his past, there was a chance he could heal. But what she didn't realize was how deeply her own life was about to be entangled in William's journey. The file he had given her contained more than just stories of his relationship with Emily. There were secrets buried in those pages. Secrets that would soon bring everything Olivia thought she knew crashing down. As Olivia sat in her modest apartment that night, the file William had given her lay open on the small coffee table. She couldn't bring herself to close it, not after the glimpse it had offered into the man she had spent months caring for. The storm outside had quieted, but her mind was far from calm. Something about the documents tugged at her, a thread of unease she couldn't ignore. She picked up a photograph tucked into the back of the folder. It was a picture of Emily as a child, standing beside a woman Olivia assumed was William's late wife, Julia. Emily had her mother's warm eyes and auburn hair, but there was something about the girl's smile that felt familiar. Too familiar. Olivia stared at it for a long moment before her heart skipped a beat. It was impossible. Olivia scrambled to the stack of papers, her hands trembling as she sifted through the pages. There, buried beneath financial records and legal correspondence, was a handwritten note. The ink was faded, but the words were clear enough to send a chill down her spine. Asterisk to William. "If anything should happen to me, please take care of her. She deserves a chance at the life we couldn't give her. Julia, asterisk." Olivia's breath caught. Her fingers gripped the paper so tightly it threatened to tear. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she had just read. Who is Julia talking about? The word seemed to point to Emily, but the phrasing felt off, detached, almost as though Julia was referring to someone else entirely. And then it hit her. The memory came rushing back like a tidal wave. A faded photograph from her own childhood, tucked away in a shoebox her foster mother had given her when she turned 18. It was a picture of a woman Olivia had always assumed was her biological mother, a woman with auburn hair and eyes so much like Emily's. The room seemed to tilt around her as the pieces fell into place. Could it be possible? Could she, Olivia, the nurse who had spent months enduring William's cruelty, be connected to this family in a way she had never imagined? The questions wouldn't stop. If Julia's note was about her, it would mean that William wasn't just her employer. He was her guardian. And if that were true, why had she been abandoned? Why had no one come for her when Julia passed away? The next morning, Olivia arrived at the mansion earlier than usual, her mind still reeling. William was in the sitting room, as he often was, staring out at the morning light spilling through the windows. He barely acknowledged her presence as she set down his medication. But Olivia couldn't hold back any longer. "Who am I to you?" she asked abruptly, her voice trembling. William turned to her, his expression darkening. "What kind of question is that?" "I mean it," Olivia pressed, holding up the note she had found. "Who am I to you, William? Because I'm starting to think I'm more than just your nurse." The color drained from William's face. His hands gripped the armrest of his wheelchair, his knuckles turning white. For a moment, Olivia thought he might deny it, But then he let out a heavy sigh, his shoulders sagging. "You weren't supposed to find that," he said finally, his voice low and strained. "Find what?" Olivia demanded. "The truth? That you've been keeping something from me this whole time." William looked at her, his eyes filled with an emotion Olivia couldn't quite place. "Guilt? Regret? Pain? Julia made me promise," he said quietly. "When she got sick, she made me swear I'd take care of you. But I failed. I thought I was doing what was best, keeping my distance, focusing on Emily. I thought you'd be better off without me." Olivia felt as though the ground had been pulled out from under her. "So you knew?" she asked, her voice breaking. "You knew I was out there alone and you just left me?" "I didn't know how to be a father to one child," William admitted, "let alone two. I thought I was protecting you by staying away." The room fell silent, the weight of his confession hanging heavy between them. Olivia didn't know what to say. She had spent her whole life wondering why she had been abandoned, why no one had fought for her. And now, here was the answer, a man who had let his own fears dictate her fate. "You had no right to make that choice for me," she said finally, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. William didn't respond, his gaze dropping to the floor. For the first time, Olivia saw not the hardened businessman or the bitter patient, but a man broken by his own mistakes. "I want answers," Olivia said, her voice firm. "All of them. No more secrets, no more excuses. If you want any chance at redemption, you owe me that much." William nodded slowly, his expression haunted. "You'll have them," he said, "but you might not like what you hear." Olivia swallowed hard, bracing herself for whatever truths were about to come to light. The hours following William's confession were a blur for Olivia. She felt as if she were walking through a storm, battered by the winds of revelations she never saw coming. William had promised answers, and true to his word, he began to unearth the truth. But each piece of it was heavier than the last. They sat in the quiet of the sitting room, the sun dipping low in the Dallas sky. William's voice, though steady, carried the weight of years of silence and regret. "It started when Julia became ill," he began, his eyes distant, as if he were seeing another time. "She kept it from me at first. She was always strong, always independent, and she thought she could handle it on her own. By the time I found out, it was too late. The cancer had spread." Olivia remained silent, her hands gripping the armrest of her chair. "She told me she had a secret," William continued, "something she'd kept from me for years. At first, I was furious. I thought, what could she possibly have hidden from me that was so important? But when she told me, I didn't know how to react." He paused, taking a deep breath. "Julia had a child before she met me, a little girl. You..." The words hit Olivia like a tidal wave, even though she had suspected as much. Hearing them spoken aloud, confirmed by the man who had been at the center of this tangled web, was another matter entirely. "She was young and scared," William said. "The father was someone she barely knew, and she didn't feel ready to raise a child. She put you up for adoption, thinking it was the right thing to do, but she regretted it every day afterward." Olivia's throat tightened. "And when she told you this, what did you do?" William hesitated, the shame evident in his expression. "I didn't know what to do. I was already failing as a father to Emily. How could I bring another child into that chaos? Julia begged me to find you, to bring you into our family. But I was selfish. I told her it was too late, that it would only make things harder for everyone." Olivia's eyes filled with tears. "So you just left me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You decided I wasn't worth the effort." "It wasn't that simple," William said, his voice breaking. "After Julia passed, I wanted to find you, but by then, the grief had consumed me. I was drowning in it, and I didn't know how to move forward. I buried myself in work, in building my empire, thinking that if I could just keep going, I could avoid the guilt. But it never went away. The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging heavy between them. Olivia struggled to process everything. She had spent her entire life wondering why she had been abandoned, why no one had come for her. Now, she had her answer, but it didn't make the pain any easier to bear. "You robbed me of a family," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "You had the chance to change everything for me, and you chose not to." William nodded, his expression hollow. "I did, and I've regretted it every day since. I thought I was protecting you, but all I did was fail you." Olivia stood, unable to stay seated any longer. She paced the room, her mind racing. "You can't just say you're sorry and expect everything to be okay," she said, her voice rising. "You can't undo the years I spent wondering why I wasn't good enough, why no one wanted me." "I know," William said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I want to try. Please, Olivia, let me try." His words stopped her in her tracks. She turned to look at him, the frail man who had once been larger than life in her eyes. For the first time, she saw him for what he truly was. A man who had made terrible mistakes, who had let his fear and pride dictate his actions, but who was now trying to make amends. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said finally. "Not yet. I'm not asking for forgiveness," William said. "I'm asking for a chance to prove that I'm not the man I was. To prove that I care about you, even if I didn't show it before." Olivia felt a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. Hope, maybe, or the beginning of understanding. She wasn't ready to let go of her anger, but a part of her wanted to believe that William could change. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice soft but firm. William nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "That's all I can ask." As Olivia left the mansion that evening, she felt a storm brewing inside her. She wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was certain: her life, and William's, would never be the same. The days following Olivia's confrontation with William were a whirlwind of emotion. She hadn't returned to the mansion since their talk, instead choosing to take time for herself to process the truth he had unveiled. But even as she tried to focus on her life outside the walls of William's estate, her thoughts kept circling back to the man who had, intentionally or not, shaped the course of her existence. One evening, after a long shift at the hospital, Olivia sat by her window, staring out at the Dallas skyline. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her. It was a message from William's personal assistant. "Mr. Bennett requests your presence tomorrow morning. He has something important he'd like to share." Olivia's first instinct was to ignore it. She had given William enough of her time and energy, but something held her back. A nagging curiosity, perhaps, or a deep-seated desire to see how far he was willing to go to atone for his mistakes. With a sigh, she typed a quick response agreeing to meet him and set her phone down. The next morning, Olivia found herself once again walking up the grand driveway to William's estate. The air was crisp, the Texas sun just beginning to peek through the clouds. She was greeted at the door by William's assistant, who led her to the library, a room she had rarely entered during her time as his nurse. William was waiting for her, seated near the fireplace. He looked different somehow, though Olivia couldn't quite place why. Perhaps it was the absence of his usual guarded expression, replaced instead by something softer, humility, perhaps, or vulnerability. "Thank you for coming," he said as she entered. Olivia nodded but didn't respond, taking a seat across from him. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," William began, his voice steady but quiet, "about how I robbed you of the life you deserved. And you're right, I did. I can't change the past, but I want to do everything in my power to make things right now." He gestured to a stack of documents on the table beside him. "I've made arrangements to transfer ownership of this house to you. I won't be staying here much longer. It doesn't feel like home anymore. But I thought that maybe, just maybe, it could become one for you." Olivia's eyes widened in shock. "You're giving me your house?" William nodded. "It's just a house, Olivia. Brick and mortar. But to you, it could be a fresh start. A place where you can build the life you've always deserved." She didn't know what to say. The gesture was monumental, almost too much to comprehend. But as she looked into William's eyes, she saw something she hadn't expected: sincerity. "There's more," William said, pulling out another set of papers. "I've set up a trust fund in your name. It's not just about money. It's about giving you the freedom to pursue whatever dreams you've had to put on hold. School, travel, anything you want." Olivia's heart raced as she processed his words. She had spent her entire life scraping by, working long hours to make ends meet. The idea of having the freedom to chase her dreams felt almost too good to be true. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Because it's the least I can do," William replied. "I failed you in so many ways, Olivia. I can't erase the pain I caused, but I can try to give you the future you should have had all along." For a long moment, Olivia was silent. She thought about the years she had spent feeling lost, unwanted, and invisible. She thought about the anger and resentment she had carried for so long. And then she thought about the man sitting before her, a man who had been broken by his own choices, but was now trying, in his own flawed way, to make amends. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice soft but genuine. "This doesn't mean I've forgiven you, not completely, but it's a start." William nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "That's all I can ask for." As Olivia left the mansion that day, she felt a sense of closure she hadn't known she needed. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. In the weeks that followed, Olivia began to rebuild her life. She used the trust fund to enroll in a graduate program, pursuing a dream she had long thought out of reach. She turned William's house into a home, not just for herself, but as a refuge for others who had experienced hardship. As for William, he moved into a smaller, more modest home in the city. He continued his physical therapy and even began volunteering at a local shelter, determined to use his resources to help those in need. His relationship with Olivia remained complicated, but it was no longer defined by anger and regret. Slowly but surely, they were finding a way to move forward together, yet on their own terms. And so, what began as a story of betrayal and pain became one of redemption and hope. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was theirs, a testament to the power of second chances and the resilience of the human spirit.